Food and water safety is a big bucket, and it includes everything from allergens to food toxicants to foodborne pathogens. And I don't have enough time to cover all that, so I'm going to focus largely on what I know most about, and that's food microbiology issues. So this presentation is going to be coming to you from the lens of a food microbiologist. It's going to be focused largely on developed countries, but the relevance is cross-cutting. And you'll see as I go through this that I give you a bit of a U.S. perspective, but it's cross-cutting because the U.S. is recipient of a lot of foods that come from other countries, as is Europe and elsewhere. And I'm going to consider water as a food ingredient in this particular talk, and I'm going to be very frank that I'm not adequately going to address the chemical safety issues that are out there, which I apologize for, but time doesn't permit me to do everything. So here are what I perceive as key topics or key issues that are food safety related, microbiology related, that are facing us, not just in the U.S., but throughout the world. The first one is ready to consume imported foods and food ingredients, fresh produce, foodborne parasites, foodborne viruses, big issue with economically motivated adulteration, especially in many areas of the world, not just the U.S. Antimicrobial resistant microbes from livestock and aquaculture production. The growing, I guess I'd call it a concern of chemophobia in the production of preservative-free foods and the unintended consequences thereof. And then finally, talk about some of the advanced foodborne disease surveillance systems that are being developed and will soon be in place. And I think this is really going to change the dynamics of what we're seeing in terms of detecting and reporting foodborne illnesses, which will put a lot of pressure, I think, on food companies throughout the world in terms of foods that they produce, especially if they're marketed through the U.S. So what do all these foods have in common? They look familiar? Bought them all in Atlanta, Georgia. They're all processed in countries outside the U.S. And what we're seeing is many of these foods that come into the U.S. now, and I'm sure it's Europe and elsewhere, are what we call consumer-ready foods. And by that I mean they're typically foods that don't receive a further process before we eat them, as shown in the previous slide. In the U.S., the import of foods is growing dramatically. We import now over 100 and I think it's $20 billion worth of food each year. It's about $20 billion less than we export. And so it's growing, and it's growing exponentially, and currently we import about 20% of the food we consume in the U.S. Here's some examples of categories of foods that we're importing. And I highlight the fresh fruits and the fresh vegetables and melons and the tree nuts and cocoa, tea, spices, cashews, bananas. These are all in that ready-to-consume category. And you can see there's pretty high percentages of these types of foods that we bring into the U.S. So what's the big deal in terms of food safety? Well, from a microbiology standpoint, there's a variety of conditions under which these types of foods are produced. The sanitation practices are not uniform across the world, and for that reason we're finding that there are what we call hiccups in the system, where we are having incidents of foodborne disease outbreaks, as well as just finding pathogens before they cause outbreaks and having recalls. Another problem we're having is that in certain parts of the world there are pathogens indigenous to those areas, and they're coming in our foods. And Cyclospora is one of those examples, and I'll talk a little bit more about this parasite in a minute, but back in the late 90s we had several outbreaks of Cyclospora infections due to contaminated raspberries, specifically coming from Guatemala. Some of the food safety problems that we have in different countries, it's still a common practice to use human feces, night soil we call it, on farmland to grow crops that are used for human food consumption. Irrigation water is a big problem in many parts of the world, where untreated human and fecal, animal fecal waste is applied directly without prior treatment. And insanitary harvesting conditions is also a problem in the produce arena, and we've had outbreaks where children that carry norovirus or hepatitis A have been in the fields and contaminate green onions, for example, that ultimately are used in food service and in homes. USDA has done a study, or a survey, I guess you'd say, of the results of FDA's food import refusal data. Each year, FDA puts together a list of the results of foods that they refuse for various reasons, and what leads the list is vegetables. Most violations are associated with vegetables, largely because of pesticide contamination, but also because of salmonella and other harmful microbes. Spices is on the list, fairly high on the list. In fact, spices is what we call one of those stealth ingredients, because it's very hard to identify them as being the source of outbreaks. But a recent study released by FDA found that 3% of the spices that they tested in a survey over 3 years were contaminated with salmonella. And those spices had been treated. They've been treated with irradiation or heat or some other treatment to theoretically kill salmonella. And overall, they found about 6.6% of the spices that were coming into this country were contaminated with salmonella. Why am I emphasizing produce so much? We bring so much into this country. Well, produce is now the leading vehicle for foodborne illness outbreaks in the United States. And you can see in 2006 it was number 1. It was down to second place in 2007. But 2008, back to number 1, 2009, 2010, number 1. So we're seeing, although, you know, obviously we're eating more produce, we want more fresh foods and so on, but as a result, we're seeing more problems associated with this, and much of our produce comes from other parts of the world. When we break it out in terms of what types of produce are causing the most illnesses, it turns out to be the leafy greens, or the lettuce, the spinach, those types of products. In 2013, we had a major outbreak with Cyclospora, and there were over 600 people that were made ill. It was ultimately found that there were probably at least 2 different vehicles or outbreaks that were occurring. In Iowa and Nebraska, where they had hundreds of cases, it was linked to some salad mix that was produced by a major provider of bagged salads, and this particular operation was in Mexico. And the second outbreak associated with this organism was from fresh cilantro that came up from Mexico. I had my colleague Inez Ortega, who's considered one of the top food parasitologists in the country, give me a list of the top 15 foodborne parasites, and so she did. And if you notice, 9 out of those 15, fresh produce is the primary vehicle for these various parasites. And the reality of it is, we don't do a very good job in the U.S. anyways of detecting cases caused by parasites, and so it's a very underreported problem in the U.S. Foodborne viruses is another major issue. This norovirus is really the leading known cause of foodborne illness in the U.S., but it's a global problem. Norovirus pervades the world, and the primary vehicles for these types of products, or these types of outbreaks, produce and ready-to-eat and raw shellfish. Also, we have other viruses of concern: hepatitis A, hepatitis E, and again, fresh produce can be a vehicle of these particular organisms. Here's an example of some of the outbreaks that, virus-related outbreaks that have occurred in the last few years. Had a green onion-related outbreak of hepatitis A, primarily here in the U.S., and those green onions were produced in Mexico. We had issues with pomegranate seeds just last year, mixed in berries that were used with making smoothies, and those ultimately ended up with several cases of hepatitis A infections. We've had also outbreaks associated with fresh strawberries that originated in China. I'm sorry, frozen strawberries. There's been a lot of concerns about economically advantageous food treatments that are not acceptable in the U.S., but they're used in many other countries. An example is irradiating soy protein products, adding antibiotics to vitamins, and one that we really don't want to see in foods is chloramphenicol, which some people have major adverse effects. DDTs applied to crops for human consumption, still in many countries. Applying antibiotics that are critical for human therapy indiscriminately in aquaculture production and poultry production in many parts of the world. And adding what we call economically motivated adulterants, such as melamine, limestone, clenbuterol, to foods either pre or post-harvest. And to drill down a little bit, a few years back we had a big recall of dairy products, pet foods that had been contaminated with melamine, which was added intentionally because of wanting to increase nitrogen content. In some cases, a substitute's been found, and old leather is now ground up and added to dairy products to increase the protein content. Limestone, ground limestone, is added to flour to increase weight. Clenbuterol, big issue in certain parts of the world. It's used in pigs and cattle in particular to speed up the rate of growth and to increase muscle mass. And then we've had issues with counterfeit certification of non-organic crops, including soybeans and millet and buckwheat. And that's not necessarily a food safety issue, but it is an adulteration issue. We had these issues with melamine several years ago, thought they went away, but back between November 2011, April 2012, there are at least 6 retentions of soy protein isolate here in the U.S. in the U.S. because of contamination with melamine in the soy protein isolate. So it's an issue that continues, it persists. Antimicrobial resistance in aquaculture and animal production. We're hearing more and more concerns about this being raised by the Centers for Disease Control. I personally think that the use of antibiotics in human therapy is probably causing a greater problem than it is in agriculture. But to be fair, the use of subtherapeutic treatment, use of antibiotics is an issue, and we need to deal with that equally as well. In aquaculture, which is a major protein here in the world today, it's common to use untreated animal and human waste to grow the fish and to grow shrimp. And today it's estimated that at least 2/3 of the world's production of farm fish is grown in ponds that are fertilized with untreated animal manure or human sewage. And about 50% of the fish and seafood is raised in these types of ponds. And frankly, we get about 85 to 90% of our fish and seafood from other countries. We don't grow that much here in the U.S. And here's an example of how it can be grown. The chickens are growing over these ponds, where underneath is either tilapia or a shrimp, and it's the feces from these birds that are the primary nutrients for growing these animals. Another example where ducks are the primary nutrient. Duck manure is the primary nutrient for the fish growing in this pond. Well, there have been studies done on seafood, and one of the big issues is salmonella contamination, and I share with you some results of different studies, but even ready-to-eat imported cooked shrimp, 2.6% of that was found to be contaminated with salmonella. And Vietnam is a primary supplier of shrimp to our country, and different studies show 25-30% of the shrimp grown in that country is contaminated with salmonella, and raw fish, about 12% was found to be contaminated. In Vietnam, they've done I think some pretty in-depth, very good studies to analyze the use of antibiotics in shrimp production. And it's very common to use antibiotics, and it's antibiotics that are important to human therapy that are commonly used, but they have to be used to help control disease in the shrimp. And the antibiotics are applied through the feed or infusion, different ways, but they accumulate in the environment. And as a result, antibiotic-resistant microbes become quite prevalent. And I mentioned important antibiotics used in human therapy like ciprofloxacin and oxytetracycline. They're extensively used, almost 100%, in shrimp production in Vietnam, and not just Vietnam, but Southeast Asia is widely used. And they kill certain types of organisms like Vibrioles and Pseudomonas that cause disease in their shrimp. So it helps control the disease problem, but it also ends up with high levels of antibiotic residues in these shrimp ponds and the surrounding environment, and subsequently proliferation of these drug-resistant bacteria. So we have many issues with the inappropriate use of antibiotics, not only in human therapy, but also in animal and aquaculture production. And the biggest concern is that these antibiotics are becoming less effective and useful. So we need to restrict their use and use them more prudently. And it has to be not just in the U.S. and Europe where we're trying to take control of this, but throughout the world. It's a very complex problem. There's not a simple solution. We can't just ban the use of subtherapeutic use of these antibiotics, because it has been done in certain parts of the EU, and as a result they're seeing a much greater use or increase in use of these antibiotics for therapeutic use because the animals get sick. And so they have to increase the therapeutic use, and subsequently we're seeing a greater increase in salmonella-resistant strains and so on. But this is a global problem. Even if we fix the problem in the U.S. and the EU, if we travel globally, we're likely to be exposed to these organisms where antibiotics continue to be used imprudently. And the same goes with food imports. If we continue to bring in fish and shellfish from other parts of the world where they use these types of antibiotics indiscriminately, we will be exposed to these organisms. I think there's been a major movement throughout at least Europe and here in America to go more towards what we call natural foods, or foods that have less chemicals. I describe it as a chemophobia, and it's largely been driven by the blogosphere, and much of this may not be science-based. In fact, a lot of it isn't science-based. It's misinformation that's being disseminated through the blogs, through mothers who have concerns about what they feed their babies and so on. And there was a meeting I attended a couple of years ago where Marion Nestle, who's a nutritionist, very well respected from New York University, and she has one of the #1 blogs in food safety as well. In any event, Marion was talking about we should be using less processed foods, and I didn't quite understand what she was saying. So I asked her what her definition of processed foods was, and she says, well, it's based on chemicals and the number of chemicals you add to a food. The more you add, the more processed that food is, and especially if the name of these chemicals are esoteric and we don't understand them. So I now understand what she means by processed foods. I don't agree with her definition, but I do understand it. And this has led, I think, many companies now to reconsider what they're putting into their foods, and I'm not saying that's a bad idea, you can't probably read this, but this just came out in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution back in December, that this particular web critic has been pushing Chick-fil-A, it's a major fast food restaurant chain, especially in the Southeast, to reduce the use of chemicals, if you will, in their foods. And Chick-fil-A has made a commitment now to remove high fructose corn syrup in several of their products, as well as food dyes. And I know other companies are going along the same way. But these can have adverse public health consequences depending on what the preservative or ingredient is. And I want to give one example, and that's benzoate. I gave a keynote address in Copenhagen 3-4 years ago, and the person after me from Scandinavia says we're eliminating all the benzoate from our foods. And the reason was because there was pressure through blogs on Tesco and many of the supermarket chains to put pressure on their suppliers to get benzoate out of their products. And it sounds good when you say it fast, but the reality of it is benzoate has a very important food safety function as well. It's not just to control molds and yeast. And by the way, he said next on the list is sorbate. And benzoate, it controls Staph aureus. If you make, for example, dairy-based bakery products, and you have a meringue or something in there, often benzoate's added, and that helps control Staph aureus. And by the way, benzoic acid is naturally occurring in a lot of different types of berries, ranging from cranberries to blackberries to cherries and so on. Well, interestingly, recently we've had some major problems with certain types of foods that would normally have either benzoate or sorbate. One being organic baby food. There was a big recall because of microbial spoilage and several consumer complaints that their babies were getting sick. String cheese, we had a big recall because of microbial spoilage. Yogurt, major recall because, you know, it's preservative free, but they had microbial spoilage. And also certain UHT packaged juice-like beverages that have been found to be contaminated. And there was, again, microbial spoilage. This is the implicated product with the organic baby food that was a major recall, and I don't know if this company is going to make it now. But the learnings that we have from this is that removing these certain types of food preservatives that have been known to be important for food safety reasons can have these unintended consequences, not only reducing the shelf life, but it may, if for some reason harmful microbes were to get into products, it would control these. Finally, I want to touch upon what's happening in the U.S. in particular, but this has global ramifications with something called the PulseNet. This is a system that CDC developed with the state health departments where when people get salmonellosis and other types of foodborne disease in different states, the state health departments will do a fingerprint based on what we call pulse field gel electrophoresis molecular subtyping, send that information to databases within the CDC, and then they'll monitor and see if there are clusters or outbreaks that are occurring. And this system has gone international, and there's different levels of commitment to this system in different countries, but it's an international system at this point. Well, CDC's been identifying outbreaks today that they wouldn't identify 5 years ago because they have this system in place. And each day, depending on the time of year, they're usually monitoring 20 to about 50 of these clusters. And each year now they're reporting about 1,200 to 1,500 outbreaks. Well, what's happened is that because of cost and better diagnosis, clinical labs are now using what we call non-culture-based methods to detect these foodborne pathogens in human cases. And if you don't have a culture to use, you can't put it into PulseNet because you have to have a bacterial culture to do the pulse field gel electrophoresis typing to put into the database. So CDC has had to change its way of doing business, and they're in transition right now. But I've seen some recent data, and they've got a much more sensitive, specific assay that they have developed. That's incredible. And, you know, they have been doing tests where they will go into processing facilities and find salmonella and listeria, then FDA will data bank that. They're now going back and they're finding through this new system that some of these plants, the bacteria from these plants are related to current or past outbreaks. So I think this is going to revolutionize how CDC is able to better detect sources of foodborne outbreaks, not only here in the U.S., but in other parts of the world as well. So there are several global food safety concerns that I think we have before us. The importation of the ready-to-consume foods in particular, I think that's going to continue to increase. It includes many countries with less than acceptable sanitary practices and where economically motivated adulteration occurs. And the microbiological safety of fresh produce is a particular concern because we're seeing more and more outbreaks and cases of foodborne illness associated with this particular type of product. The aquaculture farming is becoming a dominant global food production practice. Excessive use of antimicrobials in this type of production operation using raw animal manure and human feces as a feed, which can be a source of salmonella and other pathogens, can lead to these antimicrobial resistant microbes and further concerns about contamination. There's this growing interest in consumers, especially in the U.S., eating raw or undercooked, or in quotes, natural, no preservative foods, and this is being accelerated by the use of social media. But we've really got to be prudent in how we formulate our foods to make them safe, and I think it's critical that we have good risk communication, or in some way educate the consumer what the benefits and why we need to have certain types of ingredients present. So back to some of the examples of safety issues that I think are of common interest, perhaps throughout the world, these consumer-ready foods and food ingredients, fresh produce, economically motivated adulteration, antimicrobial resistant microbes, foodborne parasites and viruses, preservative-free foods, the advanced foodborne disease surveillance systems that are developing and will probably within 3 to 5 years be in place. So where does ILSI fit in? Well, because we have this international food network, which has common global food sources, common global food safety issues, and a common need for food safety solutions to enhance the global public health, I think ILSI is very well positioned to serve as the principal facilitator to provide both research answers and authoritative science-based essays that document the science. And then also we have this possibility of better risk communication to consumers through the capacity building and outreach efforts that ILSI is developing. So I think there are lots of possibilities for ILSI to be a leader in enhancing the public health through better or safer foods and water. Thank you.
I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues in this. This is the themes that were assigned to the different groups to kind of look several months ago as to where we might go as one ILSI. And my colleagues, King G. Teo and Rick Kennedy from the Research Foundation, and Ken G. from Southeast Asia. Okay, when we started out, what was the focus? What were we actually looking? What was the broad scope? And you can see the scope is quite broad when we talk about food and water safety and all the things that Mike just showed and the issues that are out there. So from risk assessment to food additives, microbial, viral, water for consumption and water for production. So it is a broad area that can be focused on. So what we did first was to go back and look at 3 years of activity across all the branches. So what have we been doing? What are we capable of doing? And what do we do best over the last 3 years? And we did what was probably not a real hardcore scientific cluster analysis, but I think it was good enough to inform us as to what we can do and what the scope is. So you can look at the 4 hash mark items. These were the 4 general broad areas of activity. So capacity building and education outreach, standard setting and harmonization of standards, water safety, and technology applications. And I found it interesting as I looked through this, when we look at the top, over half of all the activity with the branches is in capacity building and education outreach, with over 2/3 of the branches having this as a major activity. So it is, by and large, the major thing that we do on a global basis. Second was standard setting and harmonization, about 18% of the activity, but less branches. And I would say my analysis looking at this is that a lot of this was focused along the Asian Pacific Rim and the interactions amongst those branches. Then water safety, again, about 18% of the activity, a few more branches, and some more diversity of the activity. Last one is the technology application, or new frameworks, new ways. You think of threshold of toxicological concern, and that is the least activity and the least branches that are really engaged in it. So it kind of sets the stage for who we are and what we're doing in this activities. Okay, so what were some of the topics within each of those in the capacity building and education? Number 1 was risk assessment, and number 2, right behind it, was microbial safety. We looked at standard setting and the harmonization. No surprise, it's conforming with international standards if we think about codex in this, but also harmonization across regional food standards, and then the standardization of the methods being used in any of these activities. In the case of water and water safety, the number 1 project was the one initiated by ILSI Japan a while ago, and then is being picked up by some of the other branches and expanding as Project SWAN. There's also issues of supply and sanitation, and also ILSI India had looked at that aspect of sources and climate and resources. So what are we going to do to make sure we've got enough water for our processes? Technology application is, again, sort of framework type things, new technologies that are coming at us, threshold of toxicological concern, nanotechnology, heavy metal screening, and then things like new process validations. And Mike talked a little bit about some of those and how CDC is dealing with some of those new process validations. Okay, so we had breakout groups on Friday to look at this, where all the branches talked about these issues and where we might go. And so we have 2 potential areas that, as the branches collectively, that have put forth where we might go. Southeast Asia has led forward in the first one, and it is development of training modules for risk assessment of chemicals in food. The following bullet points are some of the caveats that came out of our discussion. It is that you need to make sure you would integrate this activity with existing global networks. Don't forget, there's a lot of activity out there, and anything that we would do needs to be integrated in these networks. Think about global best practices, because that's the idea of harmonization, but also local application of those best practices. There's multiple levels of learning. It's not just one level. There could be entry level, or there could be a federal expertise higher level of training. how would we use e-learning platforms? And some of the things that Sarah is doing in this same sort of a format, can we harmonize with some of those types of activities in making this work? And then the thing that is a forte for ILSI, and always has been, is identifying collaborators, identifying implementation partners. If any of you were at the PIP meeting earlier, this whole concept did get vetted, discussed largely, and it was very interesting about the feasibility, and that this is maybe a lot more feasible and timely than we might have ever thought before. The second one is more of a global aspect and a newer sort of focus. And in discussions with Rick Kennedy and the Research Foundation, is this concept that could we develop within ILSI an expert network for exposure assessment expertise and methods. And this could capitalize on coordinating some of the branch expertise that's already out there on global initiatives. If we think about HESI and their Risk 21 and some of those types of activities, and move forward. Then one of the other caveats that was discussed, of course, is that you need intake data to be able to really do this. But that intake data doesn't always have to be global. There's a lot of advantages in being able to have expertise to even do it with local data or smaller communities. And my final slide relative to this exposure expertise is, can we move from reacting to fear, the hazard side, which we do all the time, we see it in the media, we see the activities around that, and lead with more exposure knowledge in assessing risk in the future.